Okay, well, today's seminar, we're looking at historic roof coverings, and I'm trying to cover sort of slate, lead, and other sheet materials in about just over an hour. So we'll start off with slate. Most people's sort of concept of slate is the metamorphic material, the sort of history of this really starts in the medieval period. There had been quite a bit of use of materials very locally to where they occurred naturally in the earlier periods, the Romans and during the Saxon period. Both metamorphic and stone roofing materials were in use. But really the metamorphic slate industry started off in the 12th and 13th century when there was quite a brisk trade along the south coast. The source of the slate was Cornwall, where the Delabole area, the large quarry there, had been in use since the late Saxon period. And so there was quite a brisk coastal trade of slate, and it was coming into the major ports along the coast of the south of England. One of the main ones, of course, was Southampton. And for major buildings, sort of important buildings belonging to either king or the local bishops, or sort of the wealthy merchants, slate was used on their roofs. And on this frame, you can see the roof of 59A French Street in Southampton, where English Heritage, as it was, restored the roof and the building and opened it to the public as a small museum. And on the roof, you can see there slates from the Delabole quarry to recreate the original 14th century roof covering. And these slates are graded from fairly large ones at the eaves line up to fairly small ones at the ridge line. And then you can see there are ceramic ridge tiles, decorative ridge tiles, and finials on the roof line. The chimney here is a later addition in the 15th century. And the slates were riven from the material, and you can see they've got a single peg hull, and they were hung on the riven battens within the roof on these single pegs. And there's a lot of archaeological evidence for these slates throughout Southampton. Also, in the documentary evidence, we find that any materials that came in through the port of Southampton were registered in the port book, because taxes were paid to the town, sort of import dues for the materials coming in. And then, as it was a walled town, anything that went out through the gates to the wider countryside was also subject to a fee. And quite amazing the amount of slate that was coming in. In one single year, 1180, the Bishop of Winchester imported 800,000 slates for the work on his major palaces and construction. By the beginning of the 14th century, the port books are fairly silent regarding import of slate. And we find that the local tile industry was beginning to take off. And the people that were running that, of course, were the Bishop of Winchester, the Bishop of Salisbury, etc., who I think were fed up of paying dues for their imported materials and started off their own roofing industry. So tile really takes over. And the slate industry from Cornwall really doesn't see a revival until the 19th century. Other areas of the country also produced slate in the medieval period, but basically for local consumption. So Cumbria most of this slate was used within that area until we get to the 18th century, with the improvement of river and canals being constructed. There was a much better transport system for moving major materials. So at the top of the screen there, you can see one large country house in South Yorkshire. That is Wentworth Wood House, massive, one of the largest country houses in Britain, 600-foot long sort of facade. The footprint covers over 3 acres. And if you count up the size of the roof slopes, you've got over 4 acres of roof. All the inclined areas were covered by Westmoreland slate. The flatter areas had lead gutters and so on. It's now subject to a major re-roofing. At the moment, there's over 35 miles of scaffold tube around it just to do the central section. And they've purchased 3 years of production from Cumbria of slate to replace the existing material. In Wales, again, it tended to be local consumption right through to the 18th century, when we started to get some coastal trade and then up the rivers and canals. And again, it's a graduated system with large slates at the bottom of the roof going to sort of smaller slates towards the ridge. And to sort of get round corners where you've got valleys, these swept valleys were all slates, probably took about 5 slates, cut to an angle to get round into that valley. Well, it was really the 19th century that the Welsh slate industry took off. In 1793, the total production of slate was only 45,000 tonnes. But by 1882, it was 494,000 tonnes. What was the secret? Railways, the coming of railways, small-scale railways from the slate quarries down to the coast, and then distribution by sea, and then distribution within the country by mainline rail. And they were also exporting by sea all over the British Empire. And so the industry at the end of the 19th century was massive. It then came into decline. The First and Second World Wars affected it tremendously. And by 1990, only 5% of the British roofing industry was slate, and most of that imported from the continent. So today, we've only got 1 or 2 slate quarries in Wales still producing slate. Most of the rest of the slate and the slag heaps, except the slate heaps, waste heaps, are going for road fill materials, etc. Well, the way that the slate was produced in the 19th century, large blocks were hewn out of the stratas within the quarries and the mines, and brought into the working area as quite large slabs. They were trimmed up to regular sizes. The 19th century is the period of the tally slate, where there were specific sizes for the slates. The slates need to still have what's known as their quarry sap in them. The slate still needs to be moist in order to be able to split it successfully. The slate is then split by hand. It's riven, and in order to get slates all of the same thickness, it was split in a specific way. You started with the block and you split it in half. Then you took that half, split it down again, and then took the smaller quarter and split it down again. And so you got 16 slates all of the same thickness out of one block of slate. And that was all performed with this chap with his riving knife there. And so this sequence of splitting gave you slates of perfect thickness. When the slates get out on site, the slater goes through the slates and just checks for any imperfections, any thicker slates, so that they don't sort of ride up on the roof. Because it's very important with this form of slating that each line of slate is the same thickness, so none of them kick up. The edges of the slates are dressed traditionally in this country. They're done on, you've got an iron there, and he's using his axe, his adze there, for cutting the, just sort of dressing off to an angle. If you get sort of a tight butt joint between the slates, you get capillary action if you're not careful, water drawn in under the slates. So this is a specific way of dressing the slate with, sorry, a zac, not an adze, zac. Well, from really about the Second World War period, we started to get a lot of imported slate. It was coming into this country cheaper than the Welsh could produce it, but it was of indifferent quality. A lot of the Spanish and southern French slate coming in after the Second World War had a high percentage of iron pyrites occurring naturally within the stratas. And the problem is that with acid rain, the iron pyrites starts to dissolve, and after 25 years, instead of a slate, you've got a colander with holes right the way through. You can see here, this shot was taken in the 1980s of a new imported slate, Spanish slate roof, and it had been on the building for 3 weeks. They haven't even got the scaffold down, and you can begin to see the iron pyrites dissolving out of the slate. So particularly the Spanish slate industry was in a fairly perilous state by the 1990s as far as exporting was concerned. We were very reticent about importing the material, and so they had to clean their act up. And so now the slate has got complete traceability. Once you've selected the slate from a particular quarry, it comes in crates, and there's a label on it, so you know exactly the location, the strata it came from, and even who the chap was that did the riving of the slate. So absolutely traceable, and it's all tested now for iron pyrites and also the freeze-thaw cycle. So Spanish imported slate is much more of a sure product. We can't say the same for much of the material coming in at the moment very cheaply from China and South America. After 5 years in British reign, the colour is changing dramatically from sort of dark blues to light greys, and I've even seen milky white slates. This is due to basically calcites, natural carbonates minerals appearing within the material. And these leach out to the surface and give this sort of creamy white effect eventually on the slates. So beware of cheap gifts from China and South America, particularly Brazil. The quality is very, very variable. And if you suspect you've got some of these deficient slates, there's a very easy test. It's an acid test. Weak hydrochloric acid, if it fizzes, there's calcites present. And if you leave it in a weak acid for about 2 weeks, it may well dissolve into just mud. So, you know, be very, very cautious. They're very canny with the way that they name these slates. The ones from Brazil go under an imported name of Camborne slate. You're not getting it from quarried in Cornwall, it's coming in from South America. And the Chinese are describing their slate as Eastmoreland slate. Anybody heard of Eastmoreland? Well, it's again, you know, trying to sort of persuade you that it's coming from Westmoreland, from Cumbrian sources. So be very, very cautious with these slates. So one is fairly safe sticking to a Spanish prime grade slate or North American slate from the Vermont area. You get a good range of colours and you can match up slates from both Wales and also Scotland and Cumbria with their slate. The problem is that the state of the pound against the dollar from about 1990, it's not really been economic to import these slates. So you're rather stuck these days with the Spanish slates. You have to be very careful on selecting imported slate. Some of it is very bland, all the same colour, and with very little texture on the surface. And you know, it just doesn't look right on our roofs. What about reusing second-hand slate? Well, you can only reuse it once, because the way that you get the slate off the roof is to tear the nail that's holding the slate through the slate. You rip it using a ripping knife. You rip them off the roof. You then have to re-hole the slates from the back. And if you get too close to the center line of the slate, it will leak because of the way that the slates lap. And so one has to be very cautious reusing second-hand slate. If a slate slipped on the roof in the past, sometimes you'll find they've been nailed through the joint, from the center point through the joint in the slates beneath. And again, this is likely to induce leakage. Also, a lot of the mid-20th century imported slates were simply had sawn edges. They weren't dressed, and so again, one's likely to get capillary action. So be very, very cautious about using, reusing slate, second-hand slate. You have to really have a good slater who can select the material carefully. Okay, if your slate roof, the slates are beginning to slip, or if they're getting badly eroded due to iron pyrites, etc. One of the answers in the sort of 1970s, very popular, was this process of turnerizing, where somebody went up onto the roof with a bucket of pitch, sometimes strands of fiberglass was added to it, and this was brushed liberally over the surface to sort of glue the slates back into position. Not only was it aesthetically not very pleasing, but it means that the slates are unable to be reused. And this happened a lot with the imported slates to try and sort of continue their performance. Moss growth on roofs, now quite a problem, particularly as our air has less pollution from sort of the dark satanic chimneys of the 19th century, etc. Lichens and mosses tend to grow freely, particularly if you're under a tree canopy. big problem today, how does one remove the moss? Well, in the 1990s, we had a marvelous material called Murosol 20 that was based on tributyl tin oxide, and it killed off all mosses and lichens for about 10 years. The runoff into the gutters and then down your downpipes to your soakaways also ensured that you didn't have any lawn growing in that area, killed everything off. If it ran off into the streams and watercourses, it killed fish, etc. So COSH regulations outlawed the use of TBTO in sort of all applications in this country. So we're now rather stuck with the growth of mosses and lichens on the roof. There are one or two cowboys out there today that will come in with high pressure water lancers to blast it off the roofs, again, usually doing more damage than good. So it's something we really have to live with. In the 19th century and early 20th century, particularly in the arts and crafts period, decoratively shaped slates and also roofs with sort of sinuous curves and shapes were quite popular. Today, it's quite expensive doing re-roofing on this sort of building. These cut slates are very expensive to get reproduced today, and the curved roofs like this require multiple cuts to shape the slates to get them round the curves. So quite an expensive project. If you are short of slate, this is something that one shouldn't do. This is a real horror story where the slater realizes, he's lost 40% of his slates when re-roofing, and so he's spread them out to cover the area. And so this stretching of the slate bond, basically it's bound to leak, within a very short period of time. So don't be, tempted to allow the stretching of the slate bond. Well, other than metamorphic slate, we have other materials that can be used for roof covering. Any fissile stone, whether it's limestone or sandstone, if it splits thinly, can be used for roof coverings. There are various sources, particularly of the limestone fissile material. Popular in the south of England was the Purbeck limestone, right the way from the medieval period through into the 18th century. There was a good coastal trade with this material for high quality buildings, including churches. In the sort of eastern side of Hampshire and into Sussex and Surrey, there was the Horsham stone slate, and this would split quite nicely, and you could get fairly large slates out of it. Again, tended to be graduated slate sizes as you went up the roof. And traditionally, you head bedded the material to stop it sort of rocking. What tends to happen today, if there's problems with either slipping or damaged stone slate, the roofer comes in and he points the slates completely. This again is a horror story because it locks in any water that gets into the roof. A proper performing stone slate roof, the water should be able to sort of trickle through the system and come out at the bottom, without penetrating the roof space. Once you start to sort of repoint the surface, on the surface of the slates like this, you're holding water in the roof. The slightest imperfection and you've got a problem. In other areas of the country, the Cotswolds, the limestone there is absolutely ideal for producing stone slate covering, roof coverings. And you can see it's laid quite often without any, even any head bedding. and sometimes even the eaves are left open. Depends on sort of the amount of windage you've got on the roof. And you can see the way the water works through the roof system by the way that you've got this sort of staining here, trickling off the slates above. Again, they are traditionally single fixing with a peg, and they're quite weighty on the roofs. Probably the heaviest of all of the roofing materials is the Yorkshire sandstone slates. This material splits again very nicely, can be used for roofing, or the York stone tends to be used for paving. And the slates are extremely heavy. I've seen anything up to 4 foot square slates used on the eaves courses. So you can imagine the tremendous weight. And this required very beefy roof structures underneath to support these great weights. Again, when you come to things like valleys, traditionally it was swept valleys, so it was multiple cuts to get you round the corner between the two planes. Today, roofers tend to take a shortcut and just simply put a lead valley up through. This is the traditional way of achieving the roofs. Mitered hips sometimes, and mitered hips and sometimes mitered valleys. Again, takes a very skillful craftsman to create ones that work. Today, they tend to slip in a lead soaker underneath just to make sure. But traditionally, these did work without. Again, at abutments, flashings, lead flashings work much more readily with stone roofs. Cement mortar flashings tend to crack and allow moisture in this sort of area. So it's always worth the expense of going to a decent lead flashing. Well, the problem today is that there are very few sources of new stone slates, particularly a problem in the Horsham, with the Horsham slate. Unless you can find a farmer who is willing to dig a hole in the corner of a field and pull out a bit of the stone, and again it tends to be of indifferent quality at times. You're stuck with what you've still got available historically, and then there's the problem: what do you do on the other slopes? And so the policy in many of these areas is to move the stone slates onto those faces of the roof that are seen readily by the public, and use an alternative material on the other slopes. In other areas, particularly the West Country, we find that traditionally slate has gradually crept in to make up the deficit in stone slating, which can give a very odd effect on the roofs, and the same with tile. And in some cases, the Bridgewater large format clay tiles were used in the 19th century as a substitute material. In some areas, particularly from the 18th century onwards, it became a tradition to use the large format stone slates at the eaves area, a few courses of those, to take the sort of majority of the runoff with smaller format material like tile above. Well, so much for our natural roofing materials. If we now move on to lead, copper and other sheet materials. Probably the most historic and longest lasting of all roof materials is lead, used on our more prestigious buildings. And in some cases on our churches and cathedrals, this lead has lasted through from the 18th century. I've been up on roofs where there's been a graffiti left by the plumbers with their names and dates going back to the beginning of the 18th century. So good quality cast lead sheet has a tremendously long life, providing it was laid originally correctly and not oversized. But today, when we inspect lead roofs, there are all sorts of signs of failure. On this side of the slide here, you can see that the boarding that this lead parapet gutter has been laid on is beginning to ghost through. You can see the shape of the boarding, the joints in the boarding underneath. And this lead is thinning, not from the surface, but from underneath by undersheet corrosion. And so one's likely to get failure fairly soon with this area of lead work. Other valleys, as you walk up, you find the favourite temporary repair material, flash band, which, although being temporary, I've seen sitting there for 5 or 6 years to keep the water out. And when you see sort of a strip across a valley like this every sort of 4 foot, or in new money, 1 metre 200, this is because the lead was probably not fixed correctly. It's over long sheet lengths, and what you're getting here is the expansion and contraction of the lead forming a crystalline crack across the lead. So you get this at about 4 foot intervals for overlong sheets, and so hence the patching there. The patching at the edges here with flash band at the drip point from coming off the tile is to cover up holes right through the lead caused by acidic runoff from the roof. More of that in a minute. Here we've got another roof that's failing, and you can see that there's been solder used here to sort of repair the crack, but they're much too large a sheet on this slope, and again it's beginning to crack up at about another 4 foot interval. So the correct detailing of lead is very important, and particularly a good specification for sheet thickness and sheet size. It's no good, you know, sometimes one comes across specifications where the plumber is instructed simply to lift the existing lead and you know, replace it with a modern milled sheet lead. And if you're not careful, one finishes up with them using code 5 lead to replace something like cast lead sheet, probably weighing anything up to 10 pounds per square foot. So really good quality, thick, historic lead. And they've put it back in the same sheet sizes, and it just will not perform. It'll crack very rapidly with thermal movement. And so, you know, that is wrong detailing and was spotted. It was in the old days when local authorities had grant aid, and conservation officers, you know, us as conservation officers could go up there and make sure that our grant aid was being well spent and sort of condemn bad detailing like this. And so the plumber comes back and shortens the bay intervals, as you can see here. But again, the specification hadn't required at the steps here for the timber boarding beneath to be rebated to take the thickness of the undersheet. And so, again, I always inspect after heavy rain, new lead work, etc., to see what's happening. And here you can see that where you've got a double thickness of lead at the edge of the step here, it's formed a weir. You've got a pond, and in fact, with capillary action, this roof was wetter than before they started. So all had to come off, and be redetailed correctly. So very important to make sure that your specifications that are coming in for historic buildings are correct. When you get a listed building application in, do be very careful on the checking of the detailing, particularly of lead work. So here we've got a very well detailed roof. The architect here was very careful with the detailing, good mopstick and expansion rolls, not over long lead. The whole roof's been sort of redetailed. It does at times have implications on things like the lantern here and the flashings. Have to be careful that you don't lift the roof to such an extent that you're getting up too tight underneath the drip edges on the lantern light here. So good detailing, very important, and also inspection during and after the lead's been relayed. Sometimes it's quite a problem, the thermal movement of lead, particularly when you've got things like spires where the slope is very steep. Lead should only be fixed for the top third and left to be able to be moved, to move thermally and contract. Occasionally you find situations where people have been rather alarmed with thermal movement and they've popped in a nail to arrest the movement. And so this is what I call, shows my age, the sort of Nora Batty socks syndrome. Those of you that will have remember that TV program will remember sort of the crumbled look of the stockings. Well, here we've got the same situation with the lead that's been inhibited from being able to move freely on this roof slope. So very important that where one has to restrain the lead from wind lift, that it's lead clips that are used or stainless steel clips used to prevent that wind lift. Cornices can be quite a problem where they're covered with lead. How do you neatly allow for expansion? And so the traditional way was doing a welted joint. Very few plumbers around these days that can actually do a really neat welted joint. So again, it's a problem of a skill, lack of skill within the industry. So here we've got a well-detailed valley on a church being re-roofed, retiled, etc. Beautifully detailed with its central rolls where the valleys are over wide here to allow for expansion, not over long lengths of lead, and the plumber has detailed it well with what's known as a break lath here to stop rain or snow being blown in underneath the tiles. You've got this sort of extra precaution here. But then the follow-on trade, the tiler, spotted this nice lath just at about the right spot for inhibiting movement on his undercloak tiles. And so at 6-inch intervals, right the way along the roof, he's put a nail through the leadwork to attach his tile, thereby inhibiting thermal movement of the lead valley. And so again, it's very important to check when trades are following up after your beautiful lead valleys, etc., have been placed in position. And again here, we've got a secret lead gutter at the abutment of the roof. Again, should only be fixed for the top third and allowed to be able to expand. Again, the tiler's apprentice has come along and thought, this lead's loose, I'll help it by sticking nails in, as you can see, at regular intervals. So a big problem. Here it was, the follow-up trade was the painter on this little tower, bell tower with a bell cot above. and the lead work had been done beautifully. Expansion rolls in, and stainless steel clips to stop wind liftage on the edges. Along comes the painter and thinks, these clips are loose. I'll stick a nail through to hold them down. So again, a problem for the future. Well, sometimes it's very difficult to get the correct detailing of lead to allow for expansion, etc., particularly in things like parapet gutters, where there's very, very little fall and very long runs. And since about 1980, we've had available these joints called T-pron joints. And basically, it's a piece of rubber-like material used for diving suits, very good sort of strong material. It's bonded to lead, which is then lead welded to the runs of lead. And this will allow expansion and contraction. And at the time, they reckoned that it was probably okay for something like a 30-year life. I recently inspected one of the buildings that's in the 1982 where this process was used. I had the opportunity of checking it about 18 months ago, and they were still working very well, and there was no breakdown of this material. So it is a way, it's sort of a way of last resort of getting over the problem of detailing. One of the other problems with lead is staining with new lead work on the adjacent roof slopes. And this is the oxidization of the surface of the lead through sort of natural acidic rains, etc. And you get these sulfates being deposited on the slopes of the roof. The way to get over this is the use of patination oil, which will give an immediate sort of protective coat to the surface of the lead. You get a chemical action which then overcomes this problem of natural surface patination. Well, back to our little problem of acidic runoff. Now we've got sort of lots of lichens and mosses growing on our roofs. This creates quite a problem for lead work and any metal work beneath. In the life cycle of these materials, they exude a mild acid, which in heavy rain situations is heavily diluted and does no damage at all. But in sort of damp situations, those misty, damp days, you can get quite a concentrated acidic runoff, natural acids off the roof. And where you've got a drip point off the edge of a tile or a slate, you get a concentrated drip onto the lead work beneath, and this can eat through a hole through the lead. And so here we've got a typical valley, and we've got a slate roof here with quite a lot of lichens and mosses growing. And at the drip-off point, you can see a neat hole and then what looks like a knife cut in the lead. And again on this flashing here below. And so quite a problem. What can we do? We can't kill off the lichens and mosses, so you've got to work out a way of living with it. Again, here you can see the thinning of the lead at the drip-off points and holes through. So when I'm inspecting valleys, I sort of run along with my finger at this point just to feel whether you've got this thinning and thickening of the lead, the thinning down where you've had this acidic runoff. You might not actually have holes right through. With things like copper flashings and valleys, it's an absolute nightmare. Within 10 years, the copper kind of dissolved completely with this acidic runoff from the lichens above. And with a new lead roof here, you can see within about a month, you've already begun to get this action on the new lead. So what's the answer? Well, in the 1980s, experiments were done with copper strips on the roofs. You have to have them so far down the roof so you've got enough acidic runoff to start to dissolve the copper to produce a toxic runoff to kill off the lichens and mosses at this lower level, so it's neutral by the time it reaches the lead beneath. This is snow, by the way, not damage to the lead work. The problem with this system is, first of all, you're putting a copper strip up in the air, and it has to be bonded to your lightning conductors, otherwise you could have a problem. Also, you get a roof that's sort of got a striped sort of situation when viewed from below. Okay, if it's obscured by parapets, etc. So this was a bit of a blue streak. It never really took off, this sort of system. But what we did develop in the 1980s was the use of sacrificial lead strips. And basically, the scrap lead that was taken out of the valley was cut into 6-inch wide strips. As the lead valley was put in, you put clips in a position. The slater then did the slating, or the tiling of the roof. You then manoeuvred the scrap lead strips so that about 4 inches of it was exposed into the valley, and you turned over your clip. So now any acidic runoff is spent on this sacrificial lead strip, and after about 30 years, you just simply peel back the clips and pop another bit of lead in there, either scrap lead or a bit of sort of a code 4 lead there, to act as a sacrificial material. And in this way, you're not having to do a total sort of large-scale job replacing these valleys. Very important with slate, because in redoing a valley, you're disturbing a lot of the slate. Okay, well, there are other problems with lead that we've been noticing over the last sort of 40 or 50 years. And this is corrosion from beneath, undersheet corrosion. And it might not be immediately evident. You can see here on this section of lead work, we've got a roll here at the junction between the two lead sheets, which has been formed over a timber, what's known as mopstick, to form the roll. And that mopstick is held down with an iron nail into the boarding beneath. And here you can see a rust spot on the lead. Well, we know rust doesn't occur, with lead. And in fact, it's the rust erupting from the nail head. And this is because of water. We've got capillary action. We've got thinning of the lead at this point with undersheet corrosion. And the rust from the iron nail is actually beginning to erupt through the surface of the lead. So this is an early sign of a problem beneath. Sometimes it's much more obvious. Here you can see this sort of very odd effect on the surface of the lead, this white patching which is coming through the lead work, and you've also got a very nasty crack running right the way through the lead, where the undersheet corrosion is expanding, and we're getting a breakdown of the lead surface. And even when the lead work looks okay, this lead roof was redone sort of 30 years prior to this photograph, and just peeling back the roll on the junction here, you can see that we've got this undersheet corrosion occurring, and the undercloak, which is on top of the roll there, when you look at it closely, it's sort of paper thin. So quite a problem then with undersheet corrosion. What's causing it? Well, usually it's a change in the environment beneath the lead sheet roof. And here you can see the boarding of this roof is rather soggy. and you've got this dramatic undersheet corrosion. This roof was about 150 years old, and it had only begun to deteriorate over the previous few years. What was the cause? Well, the change of use of the room beneath this. It's a large country house. Originally, it had been servants' quarters, unheated, and so on. It's now sort of holiday lets, and underneath here is the kitchen and the bathroom, producing lots of steam and moisture. You're getting it condensing on the cold underside of the lead, and this is really starting the action between timber and lead, and you're getting this dramatic corrosion. If the lead's in contact with oak, which is a real sort of no-no, you should have it separated in some way. The tannins in the oak will attack the lead. You'll get corrosion forming, which will then turn around and attack the oak. And you can see this looks as if there's been, you know, a monster chewing at it. It's rather like lace curtains with this corrosive product. So we have to think about what's happening beneath the roofs, and today you either get a warm roof or a cold roof designed with either ventilation or no ventilation underneath. It's also important to allow free movement of the lead, expansion and contraction. And so there's great discussion at the moment as to whether one should use any underlays. Over the last 30 years, geotextile underlays, that's man-made material that's sort of needle punched to allow ventilation, is used. Very important that if you do use this material, that it's water repellent. Otherwise, it acts like a sponge, and with capillary action, you can get water pulled into the roof structure beneath. So it's very essential to take sort of note of the latest guidance from Historic England and also the Lead Sheet Development Association when renewing lead work as to what should be happening immediately beneath it. Where one does put back a cold roof, and one needs to make sure there's adequate ventilation. And here you can see a very enterprising plumber who's very proud of his lead burning skills, has produced this, which looks like the conning tower on a submarine, and it's got a weir inside to stop sort of water trickling back through. Quite ingenious. Elsewhere, you can get these pre-made hard plastic vents you can put in the slate or tile work just above the lead in order to sort of allow through ventilation. The other thing to note is the quality of the lead. And on one occasion, I came across this situation where this milled lead sheet had gone through the milling process, and it hadn't been correctly controlled. And this code 8 sheet lead, it was brought in as code 8, and in places was down to code 4 because of the tension on the rollers on the milling process hadn't been consistent. And so this was, in those days, about 15,000 pounds of lead that went back into the melting pot. Fortunately, they hadn't done very much of this lead flat roof. The other essential, of course, is a skilled craftsman. And sadly, with apprenticeships going, etc., there aren't many really good plumbers. Most of them can sort of stick bits of plastic pipe together, you know, for your central heating system, but very few are capable of doing really good lead work. The old City and Guilds qualifications seem to have gone by the board. Apprenticeship schemes have gone, so it's very, very difficult. And many of the traditional plumbers are now getting, you know, fairly aged, who are capable of producing really good lead work. Only a couple of companies in the country are really capable of doing large-scale schemes like this. National Trust Property, Petworth House, and here not only have we got sort of good plumbing, good details, leadwork details, but they have reused the original lead. They've recast it. There's only really one company in the country that's still doing this on a large scale, and then their own chaps are coming out to sort of redo the lead work. And you can tell cast lead immediately. It's sand cast, and it's got this very sort of pebble dash-like surface to it, rather than the perfectly smooth lead surface of milled lead. And again, detailing important. Today, lead burning is quite a favourite amongst many lead workers. Again, have to be very careful with hot working on historic buildings, particularly with the lead burning processes. Access for maintenance, very important, and when large-scale re-roofing is done, important to work out how it can be maintained in the future. So these days, instead of having sort of horrors like this, no way of sort of clearing this gutter safely, one's now getting systems built into major contracts where operatives can be clipped on safely in order to clear valley gutters and parapet gutters, etc. So lichens and mosses then, important to create details to overcome these problems, and you can see here sacrificial strip in action. You can see the way it's beginning to thin. The roof in the distance here, I photographed from the rooftop with the zoom lens on. You can see the problems of erosion beginning and getting worse as you get down the roof with this acidic runoff. Well, what about other alternatives to lead? Again, from sort of the 90s and 1980s onwards, we've had super soft stainless steel being used. Its detailing isn't quite the same as lead. You're getting a much more sort of boxy type of roll at the sheet divisions. But at least with this stainless steel, if it's the dull type, it will sort of go down to virtually a greyish colour like lead rather than being shiny. It looks from a distance a bit like lead, so it's okay on most historic buildings. And it has the benefit of thieves find it very difficult to lift, and it's not as lucrative as lead sheet. In the 1960s, the cure-all for all flat roof or sloping roof areas where lead had been was copper. It was coming in cheaply from what was southern Rhodesia, coming in by the shipload, thin material, so lightweight, and many of our sort of church roofs were covered with this material. And again, our large country house at Wentworth Wood House has over an acre of copper roof. After about 30 years, this becomes a colander. The 1960s copper was a real disaster, and they're now into a major scheme of replacing all these flat copper roofs with leadwork again. So it can be a very expensive mistake of the 1960s. What about other materials? Well, we've got zinc. Zinc, again, is becoming popular today for those areas that are difficult to detail. So here we've got an extension on a nice thatched listed building. And in order to get it beneath the thatch line and be fairly sort of neat and tidy here, zinc's been used with standing seams. So it can be an answer sometimes to design problems. The good old historic material, corrugated iron, we don't think of this really as being a historic material, but it's been around since the 1860s, and sometimes you'll find it on your listed barns and buildings, and it's just as much a historic roof covering now as slate and tile. And so it needs maintenance. The usual areas it goes are at the eaves. And so if one is careful, one can get a similar profile material which you can slot underneath to extend the eaves to overcoming this decayed eaves problem. So, you know, we're even now beginning to have to think outside the box for our crinkly tin roofs. Beware of substitute materials. This was a real horror I saw in the West Country, to replace a clay pan tile roof. This comes out as plastic strips. You roll it out on the roof and it's fixed down by these special screws. A real horror story. And at the junction, you get this sort of bent tin strip over. Other historic roofing materials, we've got cast iron and glass. Real nightmare these days for maintenance. One of the earliest structures in the country, 1826 at Syon Park, absolutely incredibly beautiful, but a real nightmare for maintenance. Flat roofs, asphalt, again, can be a nightmare on our historic buildings. Castle Drogo, Lutyens designed medieval fantasy for a client who had made his money and wanted to show his pedigree, had Lutyens design him a castle. Unfortunately, Lutyens was busy at the time out in India, designing buildings for the empire. And most of the design was done sort of on the back of envelopes and menus. And they're still preserved in the archives here. And it was left to the client to look after the day-to-day supervision on site. He didn't like the idea of lead roofs, slightly inclined lead roofs on his medieval building. He wanted flat roofs that he could party on, and so he instructed the builder to put flat asphalt roofs on. Lutyens had also designed cavity wall construction, but you don't have a castle with cavity walls, and so the builder was instructed to fill it with rubble. So from day one, it's been a nightmare of leaks. The flat roofs have been concrete flat roofs with asphalt on top, have been reinforced with RSJs built in. Percolation of water, of course, has created rusting, and so a real headache that's been dealt with now over the last 3 or 4 years. And the problem's been the asphalt, which is basically a viscous liquid. It's not a solid, it moves about, it pulls away from parapets, and one gets water leaking in. So what's the answer? In the 21st century, the National Trust and Historic England between them have come up with the suggestion of using the Bowder system. It's a multiple layer material with insulation in there and drainage, very detailed design system, which gets the water away and stops condensation on the ironwork within. Massive project costing £21 million and involving a great deal of work and ingenuity in order to get the Bowder system lapped up into the filled cavity walls. Stonework has had to be taken from beneath, and so the engineers have come up with a design of hanging the walls from higher up, working out the way that the stonework naturally arched. So it's the first time I've seen skyhooks in action. Just very rapidly now, over the next 5 minutes, maintenance problems. Well, the first thing these days, of course, is to remember our European guidelines on ecology and to look out for uninvited guests before entering the roof space. I usually poke a camera up through the inspection hatch and take a few photographs, particularly of what's happening at the ridge. And so you can see your unwanted guests without disturbing them to start with. can be quite a problem if you've got leaking roofs and you can only repair them once they've finished roosting and gone off in the summer foraging. Okay, things to look out for. Around the perimeters of the roof, badly aligned guttering, no end stop. This, to my knowledge, was like it for at least 5 years. The roofer put the new guttering up, didn't have an end stop to fit. Next time I'm passing, I'll pop back and put it in. Also, look at the misalignment. Sometimes aligning guttering can be quite difficult. You have sort of specialist brackets being made. Quite often the answer is to get the local agricultural engineer to weld up a special bracket with a rise and fall head and cup so that the correct fall can be got on the guttering, because it's no good putting guttering up which is level or got a dip in it. You know, it's not helping the rainwater disposal on the building. Maintenance, absolutely important, good maintenance. Annual maintenance, particularly looking for, you know, when the leaves are dropping, etc. Making sure one's got a maintenance regime in position. And sometimes it can be quite difficult getting to those areas. And at times it's virtually impossible. This is down to sort of poor design at the end of the 19th century. You know, how on earth were you intended to maintain this hidden valley gutter? Well, the answer is you need access, and either an access trap or, dare I suggest, because it's not seen, something like a Velux window that you can open to get out into this hidden valley to clear it. So one needs to think about design for maintenance. Again, on the peripheries, things like decorative barge boards, absolutely imperative that they are well maintained. Imagine the cost of reproducing this if this decay is allowed to continue. And note the next door property. This is a beautiful range of terrace of buildings with terracotta work, decorative barge boards, slate roofs. You can see what's happened next door. We've got UPVC barge boards and concrete roof tiles on in place. You know, absolutely sort of destroying the whole feel of this area of the conservation area. Yeah, downpipes. Okay, you know, gutters working. What happens to the water then? Well, it needs to get down to the ground safely and away, you know, via drains. How often does one come across this? Well, we'll get round to it eventually, you know, putting a bit of new downpipe up. Meanwhile, there's dry rot in the ends of the timbers and all sorts of horrors inside, and a little bit of subsidence now on the corner. Here on this church, defective, well, blocked head or defective joints, water pouring over this buttress, so the buttress eventually collapses. So again, very costly. And here, well, keep the ecologists away, some very fine, rare ferns growing on this grade 2-star building. So what's the solution if one's got leaking roof problems, etc.? Well, I was very entertained by this one I spotted in Southern Ireland. They had a bit of steel left from doing the large agricultural buildings, so they popped it up around their country house because they had a dry rot and leaking roof problem and so on. Put a temporary canopy over, still open to the public, and to my knowledge, it was like that for at least 15 years. So, good temporary solution. So, what is the future of our historic roofs? Well, I suppose we've got to try and balance up the future and reducing our carbon footprint. And maybe it's all right, you know, on outbuildings and garages, etc. But let's not hope that this finishes up on the majority of our listed buildings. Okay, well, that's the end of the presentation. Just a reminder that next time on the 21st of October, we'll be looking at thatch, shingle and tile. Back over to John.